So A Quiet Place was the directorial debut of John Krasinski, and in this one you get to follow Jim from The Office, and he's married to Emily Blunt. They play the parents of this family in a post-apocalyptic world. You have two parents and three pretty young kids that are scavenging supplies. The opening scene really serves as a tone setter where you see how serious this world is. You cannot make any sound at all. That's really the main takeaways. All the tips and tricks they've acquired over their time in this world. It's been a couple of months to make absolutely no sound at all. They're walking on a path made of sand. They're wearing no shoes. This is a movie that really only works if you respect the stakes and the rules of the world. The fact that you can't make any noise so you're engaged. Because as the opening scene progresses, you're immediately shown the consequences of what happens if you don't respect the sound rules in this movie. You don't stay quiet. Something incredibly bad happens to this family. I watched this movie in theaters when it came out, and I remember it's one of the most unique viewing experiences I ever had in the theater. It's why I'm kind of excited for the new one. I remember like whenever somebody in the crowd would eat a popcorn kernel or they'd move their bag or something, everyone would kind of look at them like, you. That reason it's a pretty tense watch, and it's a pretty tense world for a horror movie to take place in, but it's not without faults. I'm also a fan of the way they chose to do exposition in this movie. Instead of doing a big flashback or a dump of information about the world, they introduce you in spurts, which I think is really clever as the viewer because you're kind of seeing it act out as events come up, how you would have to respect the rules of the world. In the background of some of the scenes, you'll see like newspaper clippings on the walls where they explain how many monsters are going around, what the rules are, if they have any weaknesses, things like that they've kind of garnered over time. But mainly how they kind of tell story in this is they kind of tell you through experience with the kids. You have this dad played by John Krasinski. He's always kind of teaching his kids lessons about sound, when they can go out, some of the rules. I think it's kind of a clever way to introduce you to the rules of the world without directly just coming out and hitting you over the head with like an exposition dump. Just something I noticed compared to other movies in the way they choose to tell you the information about the backstory. I think this movie's well above average when it comes to being clever about it. And at least to me, some of the dread that comes from this movie starts with the opening scene when they set the stakes and the tension so high, you feel like this family has no wiggle room at all. It's to the point where you feel like this family's not even living. They're just existing and surviving. It feels like it would be something that if you stick yourself in their shoes, would be absolutely miserable. There would be no positive outcome to this, even if you go on to survive for a little bit. Just something I take away from this movie. It just feels like a world you would not want to be in at all. That's where some of the dread and the horror really does come from. Continuing on with the positives of this movie is the acting. I think all of the people in this movie are good at acting, the parents and the kids. Obviously, the standouts of this movie are John Krasinski and Emily Blunt. They're the two leads, but the kids are not without mention, obviously, as children actors. I think they're well above average, pretty dang good, honestly, for how tense they're supposed to be. I think John Krasinski does a really good job in this movie of displaying the emotion he needs to do about how much he cares about his family, instilling life lessons, all of the severeness of this world with just his eyes, because obviously most of the dialogue in this movie takes place through sign language. There's very, very little speaking. They need to be so quiet. Just something I think is a standout about this movie. I think he displays emotion incredibly well with nothing but body language and eye movement. And as good as he is, I think Emily Blunt is the standout in this by far. I think she's asked to do the most and she delivers the most. She has to be scared, in pain, and in labor at the exact same time. And she really sells you on the fact that she has all three of these things. I think is a very dynamic performance. Standout to me, I think she definitely steals the show and she's phenomenal. A really cool creative choice, in my opinion, both to drive the story and as a sound design choice, was to make the daughter deaf in this. I think it really stands out. Whenever she's on screen, they fully mute the audio, so you get absolutely no sound whatsoever, both from her character's perspective and outside of it. Just a really cool choice, in my opinion, to really immerse you in the fact that you'd be in such an overbearing world, especially as a deaf person. Really just highlights the tension and the fear of this. The last thing I really respect about this movie is the consistency it has, the sound, and how much it respects the rules it's built for the world you're living in. You know, and how it foreshadows things that could become controversial and could make sound in the future. For example, there's a scene where a nail sticking up from the floorboards on the stairs and one of the characters doesn't see it. So as the viewer, you're kind of left tense, wondering like when somebody's going to interact with it. Will that make sound in the future? They just do a good job of things like that. And when you have a consistency like this that you're sticking to so seriously, in which the sound works a certain way and it cannot be broken, very easy to kind of forgive yourself in some scenes to make scenes interesting and exciting, but they never really do that, which I respect. Obviously, there's some faults that comes with that, but they really never deviate from the fact at any point in this movie that you cannot make a single drop of sound. They are very consistent with that. With all of the positives mentioned, that does not mean this movie is without faults, because some of the things that make this movie incredibly unique also are kind of its downfall to some extent. One of the problems I actually do have with this movie is how seriously it takes the consistency of sound and the rules in the world. I really feel like there's such a slim margin of error in this movie. They're so handicapped by it that you can only have a certain amount of fun, and there's so many actions only that the characters can have that they'd still be believable. I think this movie really struggles with that in some parts. It's too strict. It just feels like nobody could actually survive this movie, because every single thing you have to do day to day would make enough sound that would alert these creatures. For example, like turning on a faucet, you know, turning a key, turning a light on, anything that makes any noise whatsoever would stand out and probably get you spotted. Also, there's kids in this movie, and kids could never be trusted. I don't think any young kid could ever stay quiet this permanently. They would either lash out, they would make a mistake. It's just unbelievable. Probably they've made it up into this point. And lastly, they writ a baby into this movie, and I just don't know why they did that. That's the most unbelievable part. both the childbirth process, the fact that the baby wouldn't cry at some random time. There's just no way you could ever condition a baby to not get you instantly killed day one. Just something that takes me out of it a little bit when I watch this. I wish they wouldn't have put a baby into it personally. I think it's kind of a silly choice. I am actually a fan of the creature's design in general. It kind of has like a head that looks like Venom a little bit. It's kind of a long-legged creature, listens in the sound. I think it's cool enough. Don't think the CGI is phenomenal in every scene though. And in the very end of this movie, when it does kind of get more action-packed, you're seeing the creatures more and more. It does require you a little bit to suspend your disbelief. But the movie doesn't really allow you to do that because it takes its rules so seriously. You're not really allowed to in this movie. You have to kind of adhere to the rules. But for that reason, there's a couple of actions in the final scene of this movie that just make no sense tonally to what the rest of the movie's doing. One of the final scenes when John Krasinski, the dad's character, he sacrifices himself for the kids. He has an axe in his hand and he fights a creature, but they can't see anything, they can only hear. So it would make more sense to just throw the axe off of metal or something, move the creature. Doesn't choose to do that. Obviously, it's more cinematic. He sacrifices himself, but it's kind of a stupid decision. And while the sacrifice is happening, you also have these two kids driving a truck away. Like, how did they learn to drive? They would have never learned how to drive. It's too quiet to have ever had practice. Why are the monsters not following the truck? It obviously would be standing out like a sore thumb. It's obviously roaring. And when you do finally get to the scene where they do kill a creature with a shotgun, it's just silly because you draw hundreds to thousands of them from miles away. You'd have absolutely no chance of living. Just something I would normally forgive, but it's just silly given how serious this movie takes its first half's rules. It really is a textbook example of one of these movies that when you're in a very small claustrophobic scale, it works perfectly. But the bigger you scale it up, the more you introduce things, the more flaws you're going to introduce naturally. But with all that being said, I definitely think the positives outweigh the negatives of this movie. Again, just critiques to some things I think are kind of silly and stand out, but it's definitely a movie you could do worse than. It's going to be really interesting for me to see how the new movie turns out because it feels like they're very heavily leaning into the stuff I took issue with the most. Some of the silliness and the inconsistency of the rules that came about in the third act of this one. Kind of curious to see how that turns out in the new movie. But if you've seen this one or if you've seen the second one, comment down below. Let me know what your favorite movie in this franchise is, what you thought of this one. I'm going to put a link up here at some point to my other Quiet Place reviews. You want to check those out. As always, if you haven't subscribed, what the hell are you waiting for? More videos to come. I do new releases, scary stuff, tier lists, all of it. Join me down below. That's all I got in this video. Peace.